In this video, we'll cover the basics of CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's a language to describe how HTML elements should be displayed. The first question is, why do we need CSS in the first place? In other words, what's wrong with just using HTML? Well, let's take table as an example. Without CSS, if we want to display a table with a border and some spacing, we need to specify additional table attributes. Now imagine that you manage the website of a large company and there are 100 tables across many pages on the website. To make the tables to have a consistent look, you have to duplicate the same attributes 100 times. That's lots of duplicated work. And then somebody comes along and say, instead of the borders being 1 pixel wide, they should be 2 pixels. Then you have to go through hundreds of web pages and find those tables and change them one by one. And what about displaying the tables differently on different devices? These days, there are more people browsing the web on their cell phones than using computers. So it's important to make sure your website looks good on both large and small screens. Unfortunately, there's no good way to do that with just HTML. So to address all these problems, we are going to separate different aspects of a web page. If we consider text and images the content of a page, then HTML text defines the structure, and CSS specifies how they are presented, or in other words, displayed. And then later on, we can add JavaScript to implement the dynamic behaviors in a web page. With CSS, it's much easier to create and maintain a consistent style for a website. It's much easier to adapt the presentation of a website on different media and devices. And because we don't have to duplicate the same sets of attributes again and again, it makes web pages smaller, therefore faster to download and lead to better user experience. Let's start with a simple example. This is an HTML paragraph which we are already familiar with. And this is what a so-called CSS rule set looks like. A CSS rule set starts with a selector. Selector, as the name suggests, select the HTML elements these styles will be applied to. We'll talk more about selectors in a moment. After the selector, there's the declaration block in a pair of braces. And inside, there's one or more declarations. Each declaration specifies a property and the value of that property should have. Now, even without knowing much about CSS, we can kind of tell that this rule set basically says that for the elements selected by the selector, their color should be red and their font size should be twice as normal. So how do we apply these rules to a web page? There are 3 ways to do it: using an external style sheet, or an internal one, or put the style directly on an element. External style sheet is the recommended way as it really separates presentation from structure. But sometimes it's just more convenient to use an internal style sheet or inline style. This is how inline style looks like. You just put the style on the element using the style attribute. Let's do it here in this example. Here I have a simple web page with 2 paragraphs and 2 div blocks. This is what it looks like in a browser. Now let's add the style to it using inline style. So let's put the style on the first paragraph. The attribute is called style, and then inside we can specify the rules. We'll say color is red, and then for the second rule, semicolon, and the font size, let's make it 200%. And now if we look at the browser, we can see that the first paragraph becomes red and twice as large as the others. Note that when we use inline style, we actually don't need the selector because the style itself is already on the element. Now, this is how to do it using an internal style sheet. This time we do need a selector. So to have an internal style sheet, let's specify the style element and then put the rule sets into it. So the style element should be inside the head element, and then we give it a selector, and then we say color red and font size 200%. And let's remove this inline style. And this is what it looks like. Notice that in this case, this selector selects both paragraph tags because, as we'll see in a moment, it's a tag name selector, meaning that it will select all the elements that has the same tag name and apply the styles to them. And then we can move CSS into its own file, usually using a .css suffix, so it becomes an external style sheet. So let's do that, and I'm going to create another file. Doesn't really matter how you name it. Usually we would call it style.css, and we move the rule set here, and here, instead of using the style element, we're going to use a link element. Link element has two attributes. The relationship attributes specify that this is a style sheet related to this web page. So this will be style sheet. And just like the anchor element, you have href, which is the URL to the CSS file. Since it's a local CSS file, we are going to use a relative URL. So href is style.css, and this should do it. Just to make sure we are actually getting the external style sheet, let's change the selector to div and see it indeed changes the display, right? So the paragraphs are no longer having the styles, but the two div blocks are getting the styles. So this is how we do external style sheet. Just like the style element, link element should also be inside the head element. Now that we know how CSS works, it's time to learn more about selectors and properties, starting with the selectors. CSS provides many ways to select elements. We already saw that we could select elements by their tag names. We can also select elements by their ID, like this, by their CSS class, like this, and by their attributes. Let's see some examples. So right now we are selecting elements by their tag name, but let's say I don't want to apply the styles to all of the div blocks. We want to apply it only to one of them. So the easiest way is to give the one that we want to apply the style to an ID, and again, the value of the ID doesn't really matter as long as it's unique within the page. So we'll call it D1. And now, instead of applying to all divs, we'll say I'm going to apply this to the one with the ID D1. Notice that we'll use ID selector. You start the ID with a pound sign and then D1. So now we can see that only this div block gets the style, the other one doesn't. So what if we want to, let's say, apply the styles to this div block and this p block? We can, of course, create two IDs and specify both of them here, but that will be kind of tedious. Nicer way to do it is to use a CSS class. A CSS class is different from a Java class or a C++ class. It's not really a programming class where you define, methods and fields and so on. It's really just a label. So if you use the class attribute of HTML, and then you can label certain elements with some labels, and the label names are arbitrary. For example, I'll label this one blue, and we'll also label this one blue. So in terms of CSS, we see that this div has a class blue, and this P element also has a CSS class blue. And you can have multiple classes on the same element. For example, this div can have both CSS class blue and another CSS class called big. And you'll just separate them with a space. And this one only has CSS class blue. Now, once you label your elements with some CSS classes, you can select them by using the class selector. So let's say we want to select all of those who are blue, then who has a blue CSS class, then we can simply say dot blue. So notice that for a class selector, you start the selector using a dot and then the class name. And here, let's say instead of red, we make them blue. And let's get rid of that rule. And if we refresh, notice that this div block and this paragraph are now blue. Right? The reason being, of course, they are both labeled with a blue CSS class, and then later on, we select them using that class name. And then you can select elements by attribute. For example, this one will select all the elements that has a name attribute, and this one will select all the elements that has a type attribute with the value text. So let's quickly try this. And so let's say I'm going to give this div block a name, and I'm going to call it div1. And now I'm going to change this to a attribute selector. So I'm going to select any element that has a name attribute. And if we refresh here, notice that only this one gets selected because only this one has a name attribute. And then you can, of course, specify certain elements must have not just a certain attribute, but also a certain value for that attribute. Now, these are the basic selectors, and then we can combine them. There are two ways to combine selectors. You can either concatenate them together, or you can list them together separated by comma. If we concatenate them together, it means that the element to be selected must meet all the selection criteria. For example, here, in order to be selected, the element must be a paragraph element, and it must have a CSS class blue. If we simply list them together and separate them by comma, it means an element just need to meet one of the selection criteria. For example, here, an element can be either a H1 or a H2 or a H3. So go back to this example. Let's say we specify P, div. This one will basically says we are going to select all the P elements and div elements, right? So as long as the element is either a paragraph or a div, it will be selected, and now they are all selected. And the last commonly used selector is the universal selector star, which selects everything. This is actually something that you probably won't use that often, but it's used often by CSS libraries to select all elements and then set some basic style, which use as a baseline style for that CSS library. So what happens if an element gets selected by different rule sets? For example, here we have two rule sets. One says that paragraph elements should be red, and the other says elements with CSS class blue should be blue. What about a paragraph element that has CSS class blue? Should this paragraph be red or blue? Well, this is where the cascading part of cascading style sheets comes in. Which rules wins is determined by three factors: importance, specificity, and source order. First, you can label a rule important, like this. If a rule is labeled important, it usually wins. Secondly, more specific selectors will win over more general selectors. For example, an ID selector will win over a tag name selector. And the third, the rule closer to the element will win over rules that are further away. So these are the general principles. But in practice, it could be quite difficult to decide. For example, which selector is more specific or closer is not usually that easy to tell. So the best way to check is you're actually just opening up the developer tool provided by your browser and take a look. For example, here I can go to Tools and Developer Tools. And here in the Elements tab, it will show all the elements. And let's expand this. And here it shows the first paragraph, the div, the p, and so on. Okay, so let's close this one. No, I need to. Okay, so if we select this p element, it shows all the styles that are applying on this p element. And you can see that the browser applies some default styling on the p element, like all the margins and stuff. And now this is the one that we applied in our CSS style sheet, and this applies the color blue on this p element. So with the help of developer tools of your browser, it's very easy to see which rules are applied, which rules are being overruled or lost to other rules. Okay, now that we understand the selectors, it's time to learn some properties to style text. In particular, we'll learn the properties to set font and color, indentation and alignment, and the properties that control text transformation and declaration. First, let's see how to set font. Setting a font for a web page is a little different from setting a font on a computer. The problem is that the people visiting your website could be from all over the world. They could be using different computers, different cell phones, different operating systems, and so on. So there's no guarantee that a certain font will be available on their device. So instead of setting a specific font for your web page, you'll be setting a font family. A font family usually includes a list of fonts, and the browser will use the first available font on the list. The general convention is to specify a preferred font, a web-safe font, and then a generic font. The preferred font of course, is the font you want the web page to use. But if it's not available, the second choice is a so-called web-safe font, basically one of the fonts that are available on almost all platforms and devices. You can check out the linked article to see what these fonts are. If we are really unlucky and the device doesn't even have the web-safe font, then the last choice would be a generic font. There are 6 generic fonts. You can think of them as types of fonts rather than a specific font. The first type is serif, which are fonts that have serifs. A serif is a little decorative stroke at the end of a stroke. This font, for example, that doesn't have serifs, but if we change it to another font, for example, if we change it to which one? Which one has some serifs? Really? No? Okay, here. So we have this engravers MT. Okay, doesn't really matter, but notice that at the end of the stroke, there's a little decorative stroke there, and that's called a serif. And serif fonts are the ones that has serifs. And the sans serif, of course, are the fonts that don't have serifs. And then there's the monospace fonts. Monospace are fonts where each character has the same width. This font type is usually used to display things like program code. Cursive fonts are intended to emulate handwriting, and fantasy fonts are intended to be decorative. When you specify a generic font, you are basically saying that the browser can pick any font in that type to display the page. We can use a font size property to set font size. There are several units you can use to set font size. You can use pixels, px, you can use points, pt, or you can use relative size, which can be expressed in either a percentage or the size of current font, represented by em. Let's see how it looks like. So let's say I'll specify font size for paragraphs to be 24 pixels. And now they are larger than the div blocks. And we can use points and percentage, which we just saw, or relative size, which is the same as percentage. There are some predefined font sizes. For example, you can simply say, I want small fonts, and they become smaller, or you can say medium or large, one of those predefined font sizes. By the way, this is how you can add comments to your CSS code using /* and */. The double slash does not work for CSS though, only /* and */. Okay, for colors, you can specify colors using a predefined color name like red, or as RGB values in either numbers or hexadecimal values. For example, here we're using the predefined name blue, and instead we can say RGB and red, green, blue. So let's say red is 0, green is 255, and blue is 0. So it should give us green. And we can also use the hexadecimal form. Oh, by the way, color is for the foreground color. And if you want background color, use the property background color. Let's take a quick look at this page, which is standard for predefined web colors. So here we can see that there are some predefined colors like black, silver, red, purple, and so on. And if you scroll down a little bit more, there are some additional colors like Alice blue or antique white or aqua and so on. And we can also add transparency to a color. So let's try making a transparent background. Let's first change this to, let's say, background color. That means it's going to set the background to green, right? And if we want to make it a little bit transparent, we can add one more value, often called the alpha value. And this value is between 0 and 1. 0 means fully transparent, and 1 means fully opaque. So let's give it like 50% transparency. So it's a little bit transparent, I guess. How about make it even more? Okay, maybe a little bit too much, but you'll get the idea. Now here are more font properties. You can do font style, font weight, font variant, line height, which change the spacing between lines, and you can put all of them together inside one property called font. Let's try a few of them. Let's say we want to make something bold, so we'll say font weight, and we'll change this one to font weight bold. And now they're bold. And you can adjust how bold they are from 100 to 900. So let's say they're a little bit bold, or they are quite bold. And we can change the line spacing. So let's say we want line height to be 50% more. So you can see that it increases the spacing between lines. And for example, if you are asked to write an essay in double spacing, that means you would want to set this one to 200%. And we can do indentation and alignment. So text indent, let's say we do text indent, and this will indent the first line of a paragraph, and let's say we want to indent roughly 2 characters. Okay, so it's more than 2 characters, but EM is the size of fonts rather than the width of a character anyway. And we can do text align, we can align left, center, right, or justify. And here, I think it's right aligned. And if we make it, let's say, text align let's do center. So now it's center aligned. And if you have a large block and your text only occupies a part of it, you can also do vertical align, whether it's top or bottom or middle. And then we can do some transformation and decoration. For example, we can make everything uppercase or lowercase, or we can capitalize the first character, and we can do underline, line through, and so on. So let's say we want to do uppercase and then line through. So let's say we'll first do text, transform, and we'll have everything uppercase, and then we'll do decoration here, and we'll do line through. So line through is the effect that we cross out everything, and occasionally you want to have that type of effect. So this covers the basics of CSS. See you in the next video.